Hello, and welcome to this special research forum hosted in partnership by the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy and the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at The Ohio State University. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are glad that you're here. My name is Dr. Rebecca Dorr, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Crane Center. We are really thrilled to have two incredible speakers with us today to discuss race and racial equity in early childhood development. First, we'll have Dr. Marisha Humphries from the University of Illinois, Chicago, who will discuss the importance of centering race in children's social emotional learning to promote healthy development. Then Dr. Clemens Noelke from Brandeis University will share how unequal neighborhood environments contribute to racial ethnic inequities in children's outcomes. Each of our speakers are experts in their fields, and I know I'm looking forward to learning more about the recent research on this important topic. In terms of format today, I will first introduce Dr. Humphries, who will be our first speaker, and she will present for about 30 minutes. And then we will have an opportunity for you, our audience, to ask questions and engage with Dr. Humphries. Then my colleague from Kirwan will introduce Dr. Noelke, who will present and have time for audience Q&A as well. Throughout the session, we'll have folks monitoring our chat box, and we'll be adding some housekeeping items there. It's going to be a great forum, and we really look forward to your engagement today. So with that business out of the way, I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Marisha Humphries. Dr. Humphries is an associate professor and licensed clinical psychologist in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Dr. Humphries' research looks at African-American children's emotional and social competence and the ways that schools can support children's development in these areas. Through her work, she wants to develop an integrated approach to studying African-American children's normative and pro-social development and use this research to create culturally and developmentally appropriate school-based behavioral promotion programs and curricula. Dr. Humphries' work has been widely published in leading academic journals across the country. Today, she will discuss the critical importance of race in a child's development and how to center race in social emotional learning for school professionals and an early childhood curriculum. The social emotional learning framework utilized in her work addresses issues of power, privilege, prejudice, discrimination, and social justice to facilitate equitable learning environments. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Humphries.
All right, wonderful. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'll just get us started here. Okay. And hopefully we can all see. Awesome. Great. So again, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this presentation and just communing with everyone around these important topics as we think about early childhood. So as was noted, my talk is going to focus on the role of race in social and emotional learning and thinking about social emotional learning as an equity as a lever for equity in early childhood education. So to get us started, just kind of giving a framework for how the session will go is that I'll talk a little bit about the ringing the alarm that me and my colleagues are giving as we think about this concept. Then I'll move into talking about racing, what I'm calling racing pre-service school professional training, and then move into actually curriculum presentation around how do we think about all the things that I mentioned as it revolves around race and social emotional learning. And then obviously, as was noted, time for Q&A. So what's the alarm that we're ringing? Is that race matters. My colleagues and I really want to put forth this idea that race is often missing from early childhood research, education, and practice. There's this kind of colorblind orientation, color neutral. You hear a lot of, I don't see color, I just see children. Or the other aspect is we want to protect children. Shouldn't we keep them protected from issues like race for as long as we can? In the early childhood period, it's definitely not the time to focus on that. Early childhood field psychology often present a universal orientation to research as it relates to, in practice, in terms of reinforcing applicability to all. Issues about race and ethnicity are often treated as exceptions or deviants. And so we're ringing this alarm saying, no, that's not true. Like race is a very important matter when we think about early childhood, and we must attend to it because it impacts children's social, emotional, and academic abilities. And race, we know, is complicated with pervasive inequalities that exist in structures that young children are experiencing. And this idea of kind of protecting doesn't exist. The early childhood period is not a period of protection. Children are impacted by race in utero, from the type of care their biological mother receives or doesn't receive during that developmental time to when they're born. So they're not protected from race. And so ignoring these issues undermines children's emotional social development, especially children from historically underrepresented racial and ethnic backgrounds. And so as we think about that, it really pushed our work into thinking about how do we center race in something like social emotional learning? And let me just start by saying social emotional learning in particular, because in the field of education, it has become this space where we see a lot of social emotional learning. As a result of the pandemic, there's a lot more interest in supporting children's social emotional development, their mental health. And this work has been going on for decades, so it's not new, but there's more of an attention to it now in this current space. And so we believe that traditional social emotional learning has taken that universal orientation. So how can we include race in this work? And so this is what kind of is leading, has led me into the work that I'm doing right now. One that, many of us know, whether from research or our own experience, that emotional expressions and social behaviors are influenced by culture. And so how do we not pay attention to those things? A student's race, ethnicity affects how they view themselves in relation to others, how they view themselves in the world, and how they're viewed by others. And so we can't take this universal orientation, we contend, to social emotional learning that doesn't address these types of issues. And we know that emotions are foundational to children's development. And I contend, many talk about the integrating social emotional learning into education. I take a different approach and say that actually education needs to be integrated into social emotional learning because social emotional development is foundational for learning. Learning can't happen if children's social and emotional needs are not being addressed. So when we think about this and we think about racing, as I'm calling it, social emotional learning, when young children get to school, they get conflicting messages about emotionality. Black children's emotionality is often misinterpreted as problematic. They're negatively characterized as disruptive, emotional, loud, and all of this is a function, not all of this, but much of this is a function of an implicit bias. And so teachers often take a what I call benign neglect to children's positive emotionality. And so the emotional experiences, their cultural emotional experiences that they're bringing into educational spaces, care spaces or educational, are not seen in positive ways. There's a laser focus on negative emotionality. And from our experience in terms of observing classrooms, things that are actually labeled as positive by trained observers can often be taken up as negative by the teacher if they are looking at this idea of quote unquote being loud or being very boisterous and social as negative. And the positive behaviors often go unnoticed. And a part of this we think has to do with the fact that there is beyond the implicit bias that many teachers don't understand how race impacts children's learning and develop, how race is situated in emotions and how it's expressed. Because if you're looking at a child's emotional expression and behavior through a lens of your own racial ethnic background without considering that of others, then you're often going to lead you to this negative orientation. So as a result of these conflicting messages, research has also traditionally only focused on the negative emotionality of children with little focus on their normative or positive development around emotions and social behaviors, to the point that many of us don't even know what it looks like, for example, for Black children. But in research that we've done, Black children have moderate to high levels of emotional competence, positive emotional strategies, and are engaged in active engagement. And I'll just say in a study that we looked at, looking at having trained observers go into classrooms to observe children and to see how they're interacting with others, with their teacher, and coding for various emotional and social competence behaviors. It was very interesting that children's positive social behaviors with their peers was often not rated as positive by the teacher. It was actually rated as negative. So this mismatch, these conflicting messages are happening. And so as a result of that work, and traditionally the field of social emotional learning kind of taking this universal approach, it's always been a critique of many of us in the field of why race isn't there, why aren't we racing SEL? And in the last couple of years, the main I would say often viewed as the main leader in social emotional work, the Council organization updated their orientation to social emotional learning to what is Jagers has termed as transformative social emotional learning. So transformative social emotional learning is this process where young people and adults, and that's important because even though in the past social emotional learning was intuitively about children and the adults, it always just centered on children. Now it is purposefully pulled the adults into the space. But it's a process to build strong, respectful, and lasting relationships that facilitate co-learning to critically examine root causes of inequality, develop collaborative solutions that lead to personal, community, and societal well-being. And so this framework, this conceptual framework is what is at the foundation of the work that I'm going to present today, because it allows us to really center issues related to race and identity in the work. And you may say, well, I don't see race here in this definition, but this conceptualization of getting at root causes of inequality, we know there's racial inequality, is centered on the work, and to develop these relationships and to think about community is really important. And so here is just kind of a visual of what the traditional domains of social emotional learning look like. And then it's centered in the various contexts that it interacts with. So you'll see when you're talking about social emotional learning, we're talking about constructs that have to deal with the self, just being aware of your own emotions, how to, manage them, how to use them in social situations, being aware of others, developing positive social skills, relationship skills, and then using all this information that you know about emotions, about how you use them in social situations and how others may be thinking or feeling to make responsible decisions. So the first study I want to talk about is a training pre-service training program that my colleague McKay Jackson and I developed with pre-service teachers and pre-service school social workers. And here we wanted to take our work from the classroom and our research to think about, well, if we're saying teachers don't understand the role of race in children's development and emotionality, then the best way to help them understand it is to teach new teachers, new social workers who are coming into the field about this work. McKay Jackson and I, McKay Jackson is in social work, a trained social worker and professor. She talks about it in her classrooms. I talk about it in my classrooms when I teach in the teacher pre-service program, but we noticed that wasn't enough. It was just in our individual classroom. So we developed this training and centered a qualitative study around it with purposeful sampling. And the reason why I decided to look at teachers and school social workers is because these are the professionals in the building. And if we think about social emotional learning, if we think about supporting children's social emotional development, these are the primary people in a school building who are doing it. So how can we work on and think about training them to understand this work, and also to think about how could they work together. And so we had a small sample, and this was like a pilot study for the training of elementary education pre-service teachers and school social work students. Both were in their last year of their program. So they were on their internship in schools doing their work. The majority were female, which represented both of our programs. And majority, as you will see here as well, were white. Again, at the time the data was collected, represented the students in both of these programs. And the interesting thing about it is I'll note that we I was talking as well about the idea of, how they can work together to do this work in their building, is that both of our programs or both of our schools or colleges are actually in the same building, just separated by a floor. But there is no collaborative co-work that's happening. So another part of this work, which I won't really get into for this presentation, also centers around how do you think about this collaborative work when we're doing SEL, racing SEL. So we had 6 sessions along with a post-training focus group, training sessions. Each session was about 2 hours each. And you'll see the content we focused on issues related to pervasive social, economic, and racial educational inequalities to help our candidates understand how that impacts learning, how that impacts behavior, how that impacts emotionality. We specifically engage in training with the intersection of, once they had that foundation of positive racial identity with social emotional learning, and then how to facilitate meaningful activities in their classrooms, or when school social workers were either coming into the classroom or doing groups outside. How do you integrate this type of orientation, race-infused positive racial identity, in their SEL work? Because some of them did have experience with other social emotional learning programs. So how do we think about this work? So, and how to collaborate. How do you work together? It was very interesting. Many of you may be aware that both didn't really quite understand all that they did in their work. There was very siloed. Like, obviously, social workers know that teachers are teaching, but what does that classroom practice look like as it relates to supporting students' social and emotional development, but also for the teachers really understanding what school social workers do, and how to join with them to support this positive development. So we did a qualitative analysis, looking at content analysis of the training sessions as well as the post-training focus group, to get a sense as to what our teacher candidates were experiencing and how they were taking this training. And one of the themes that emerged was this idea of function of color blindness. So this shouldn't be surprising. I started the talk off with talking about this idea of, in particular, in early childhood, and these candidates were across, not just in early childhood, but they also had a sense of color blindness. And it's interesting because both programs, position themselves as being about urban education and looking at inequality and race. But as one of the candidates from the social work program indicated, it's like, I just never realized my whiteness before this year. So before this training, and I've worked in schools where it's been predominantly Black. And I think partly because of my whiteness, I've kind of thought that I can go anywhere and connect with the kids. And so this emerged, and it also helped to understand how they were looking at the ways in which their children and their classrooms in the buildings were expressing themselves emotionally and socially, and the disconnect that was happening. Another theme that emerged was that, as an extension of this, is I haven't noticed. And this is one of our elementary teacher candidates who was saying that, there's this whole world that I didn't even know about. There are things that are within the community, and I guess it affects the culture in that area at least. I haven't noticed. I don't think I would ever notice those things or ever be able to relate to those things. I haven't been exposed personally. This was, very surprising, but also concerning. Like, here we have a teacher candidate going out and saying that because I haven't experienced, I haven't thought about it, I can't relate to it. This is someone who's going to be responsible for the education of young people in kindergarten, first, second grade, or early childhood folks. And they're not thinking about these things. And they're coming out of this program. So we learned from this training that it really did open up and extend learning to our candidates that it doesn't seem like they were able to take up. And the interesting thing is they had an understanding at an intellectual level of these issues. They didn't have an understanding of what it looked like in practicality, what it looked like in the classroom, and what did it mean for their own practice and how they viewed themselves. And lastly, the last thing that theme that emerged was around silencing of emotion. That candidates talked about that when they were in certain schools, kids couldn't express their emotionality. So Olivia here is saying, I've noticed that the lower the income of a neighborhood, the more structure. I was in a classroom where they told the kids they can't have facial reactions to anything, and that anyone says. So there's no laughing. And other candidates, they were talking about how hard that was. But think about how dehumanizing it is for young children to be, or children to be in a classroom, be in a school space where they can't express their emotionality. So from this work, we realized that, candidates were still struggling, even though they knew intellectually about these issues, to center race. They noticed that in schools that largely served African American, Latinx, kids from economic background, the kids' emotionality was dampened or completely silenced. And they just didn't know how to deliver this work within the demands. And so as a result of this, it really pushed my thinking into, you can't, doing this work as an island in a building, an island in your classroom or in your social work office practice, just doesn't work. And so we have to really think about the leaders. So this led me into infusing social emotional learning into school leadership from that transformative perspective, where we talk about issues of race, power, and privilege. And so if you look in principal preparation programs, social emotional learning training in general is just often missing. Teachers are barely getting it, but principals definitely are not systematically getting it. And in order to do this work, you need systematic school-wide implementation. So you need a champion, you need a school leader who believes in this work. So they also have to be trained in understanding what are the inequitable frameworks that are happening, so that they can advance equity in their schools. And again, I'm positioning social emotional learning as a way of doing that. And so often what you see is school leaders will say, okay, I'll purchase a program. And I can name some programs that are used for social emotional learning, but they're not leading it. And if you evaluate those programs, and I have students who are right now doing some of that work, it doesn't have this race orientation. It doesn't have this lens towards transformative equity. And so the work has led us to say, you know what? Our school leaders need to be supported in engaging in self-reflection and getting SEL training, so that they then can facilitate that teacher and staff learning in their building around social emotional learning from this transformative perspective. They have to start creating structures to support not only the students, but the adults. And they have to interact with adult students and their families in ways that reflect this culturally responsive social emotional orientation. And so we started working I started working with the EDD program and unpacking what was not only being taught, but what the coaching practices look like. And so what we realized and what we started implementing is professionals, particularly our leaders, they need to reflect on race and ethnicity. How it informs their practice. And so the coaches in this program were already kind of interrogating race with their practice, but they hadn't connected it to social emotional learning, and they weren't specifically doing that. So we started working on that. How, as a coach of a emerging developing principal, do you support them in understanding the role of race in their practice and the intersection with social emotional learning? And so they also needed this interprofessional and collaborative practice. So the interesting thing that emerged with this work is that it was train the trainers. So I ended up engaging in training the coaches, working with the school leaders, and then working with the school leaders from the other end and from the classroom. So it ended up being this kind of wraparound experience. And so as a result, what we realized is that we started, with the result of this work, it started reorganizing and restructuring actually the EDD principal prep program to include these issues of what type of pre-service training did they need to really incorporate SEL in their principal practices from a race perspective. So we started centering SEL in the coaching practice. It's a main tenet in the coaching work that's now done in this program. The coaches get ongoing professional learning and training in transformative social emotional learning. They themselves engage in reflective practice, so they then model that and bring that into the coaching with their individual coachees, their principal trainees. Developing leadership. A part of this work is we developed a leadership PLC for the coaches. And now assessing how is this work happening with our leaders, developing leaders. So their emotionality when they're coming into the program, kind of how they think about social emotional learning, how they understand themselves in terms of their identity, and then assessing it throughout the program as they're getting the coaching and as they're getting the on-board training in their classrooms. So as a result of kind of training the trainers, training the coaches, thinking about our school social workers. That's the building. And as I kind of gave a nod to, is a lot of social emotional learning programs don't take this perspective because they're built on a universal program of all kids can kind of just get the same thing. A lot of these programs are built based on research that center white middle class child development theories and don't consider the emotional experiences, the cultural background and development of children from Black, Latinx, and Indigenous and Asian backgrounds. So as a result of that, thinking about kind of the practicality, as I mentioned before, we really need to think about how social emotional learning is the foundation for academic work. So it moved into curriculum development. And so the curriculum I want to talk about here is the Great First Eight curriculum. And Great First Eight is, sorry, just want to move along, is an all-day project-based curriculum. It's birth to eight that for children living in metropolitan areas. And this is a full-day curriculum. So how this is different than other curriculums is that this is just not a social emotional learning curriculum. This is a full day curriculum that's research and standards aligned to math, literacy, social studies, science and engineering, as well as social emotional learning and social justice. And so social emotional learning is integrated throughout the day, as well as having its own part of the day. And so this curriculum really is trying to think about the whole child perspective as opposed to, okay, here's your curriculum on social emotional learning. Make sure you do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 20 minutes. Okay, now my slides. Okay, here we go. They stopped advancing. Here we go. Just coming to the end. And so as you saw these competencies before, the same is here, but what we've added or what I've added to these along with my colleague Ward is issues related to cultural identity, creativity, and agency. Again, really thinking about race in this work. And so during a specific part of the day, in addition to it being incorporated throughout, is what we call community time. And this part of the day, as we focus on those competencies that I just shared, teachers receive professional training to do the curriculum in general, because it's project-based learning for all day, and most have no experience in doing that, but also how do they incorporate race in their work with the children. The lessons have it incorporated in, but we have to give them support on how do you accentuate that? How do you ask and answer the right questions? And so we do that in part of it is with read alouds. It's early childhood, as I said, it's 0 to 8. So these are some of our books from our actual kindergarten curriculum where we're talking about different aspects of emotionality, but race is centered. How do we ask questions? We teach the teachers, how do they ask questions? How do they acknowledge the children's understanding? And I'll just say real quickly, because I think I just have 1 or 2 minutes left, is one of the approaches we also use, and this is used throughout the day in the curriculum, not just in community time, is the read approach. And so this teaches young children to act on injustices. So it requires a supportive teacher who honors children's agency and worldview. And this is really critical in this work. And so we provide that support for them, but kids are able to and are taught how to recognize unfair and unjust things in the world. That could be in their classroom or their school or larger community, how to ask questions and reflect on what they see as injustices, as well as to then what can they do? Again, early childhood perspective, kids can do this work. They just need the support. And so we really use the read alouds. Some of the books, just a small sample of the books, we have over 100 books in the community time part of the day, are used to help them identify these noticing scenes of injustices and how they would respond. And so just to sum it up, if we really want to promote racial equity in early childhood education, we got to think about SEL work that needs to be critical. It needs to be systematically represented by race, ethnicity, power, and privilege, implemented by our school professionals. They need to be trained in it. They need to be trained in how to integrate positive racial identity into the work, how to think about their own identity in the work. really focus on culturally relevant pedagogy and the implementation. And so our teacher practices need to include cultural knowledge, emotions, experiences, learning, and the communication styles of the Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian children that are in the classroom, not just based on traditional child development theories that only centered one particular group. And so this is just a little bit of our collaborators in this, my collaborators in this work. And so I just would like to thank you, and we'll open it up for Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. We've had a lot of good questions coming in the Q&A. So please, audience, continue adding those there while we have this discussion with Dr. Humphries. I want to start with a question that goes back to sort of the beginning of your talk that a lot of people were interested in, about whether you could give some examples of when Black children's emotional behavior is viewed by researchers as positive, but by teachers as negative. Could you give some examples of when that occurs?
Sure. And so I'll clarify. I wouldn't say that it's viewed positively by researchers. I would say it was what the work that I presented was when we had our observers go into the classroom. Because if you look in research, traditionally, Black children's emotionality still looked as negative. So in the classroom, a good example is this. Children were engaged in work. The children were interacting with their peers, talking, helping each other with work, helping each other with whether it's getting materials or what have you. And so it was really showing their positive social skills, helping others. The teacher viewed it as being disruptive. And it wasn't as if the teacher was, some might say, well, if she was or he was teaching, then it was disruptive, even if they were helping. The teacher wasn't. They were in doing small group work. Mm-hmm. But the teacher still viewed that as negative because and the teachers, we can only assume, wanted quiet, focus on yourself, even though it was group orientation. So that's an example of one way it's not looked at negative to positive. Another is kind of emotionality. Children getting emotional in the classroom, even if it was being excited about something, teachers viewed it as disruptive, as opposed to, oh yeah, the kids are excited because we're going on a field trip today. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean that, okay, we need to get work done and maybe it is taking time away, but how do you think about that from a developmentally appropriate perspective? Also, emotionality being perceived as aggressive. That children's emotional, like, well, they're so aggressive. It's like, well, what did they do that was aggressive? Because they were upset. Everybody is allowed to experience every emotion. But apparently for Black and Brown children, they are not. They're not allowed to be able to experience anger or sadness. And everybody gets angry, everybody gets sad, and everybody gets happy. So those are some of the examples that we saw.
Thanks. That's really helpful. I think related to that is a question where someone says they've observed in that public schools that use tracking, so honors classes versus regular classes, often have majority white students in the honors classes and will deny qualified minority students entry into those classes based on their disruptive or negative behavior. Do you think that this lack of understanding emotionality of children of color is contributing to this problem? Absolutely.
I think it definitely contributes to that. I can just also bring in my experience as a clinician about children who I was working with who did have mental health challenges or diagnoses and were in special education classes or in regular classes and not in more advanced classes. And as you know, working with the teachers and helping them kind of understand how to structure an early childhood classroom and what's developmentally appropriate behavior, we would hear things like, oh, this child is really smart. Oh, this child knows a lot. Well, we're not here talking about their academics. We were talking about their behavior. And so they can't parse the two apart. So it absolutely contributes to them not being in classrooms where they can get more advanced learning. And when children are, in our experience, again, I'm talking about from a clinical perspective, and my many years of working with different schools and families, is that these children they're excelling. Of course they should excel, right? And so yes, that definitely is there. That's a really good question that I don't think we problematize enough.
Right, not linking up those two areas. Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Thank you. We had one question sort of if you could talk about different SEL curriculums that are available. I don't know if you want to go into that if you're not endorsing specific ones, but we also had a question from our Director of Evaluation and Innovation, Dr. Sunny Munn. Many schools are adapting the zones of regulation SEL curriculum, and she wondered if you could talk about your perspective on this curriculum and how it centers race, and what do teachers need to know or learn in order to use this curriculum effectively for all children.
So I'm not as familiar with that curriculum, definitely as it thinks about race and ethnicity. I think that I don't endorse any particular curriculum other than Great First Aid because I'm part of it. But I will say what I see in SEL curriculum are things like they don't specifically talk about race, whether it's conscious discipline, whether it's path, whether it's second step. Is there a space for it? Yes. What often happens is there's this backdoor way of trying to deal with it or leaving it to the teacher to try and figure it out. And we're just showing you that our teachers are saying they don't really know how to do this work. They need their own support. So leaving it to them to do it is really problematic. And we know even in early childhood that there's a great deal of bias that happens for Black and brown and low income children by their teachers, right? And so I would say if you're looking at a curriculum and they're not specifically calling out these types of identity issues, that what they're doing to address race and ethnicity is changing the colors of the picture cards or changing the names of the characters, you're in a bad space, because that's just kind of an awareness that we got to think about race. That's not a way of actually getting at it. So I think that's the best way to look at it.
Yeah, thank you. We did have some specific questions about your curriculum. So does this curriculum include a component to build a teacher's social emotional skills as well, which I think is related to what you were just saying. So many times children's behaviors escalate due to a teacher's response. How can we or a Great First Aid build the teacher's skills to remain composed, to be able to respond in a helpful way rather than causing further escalation?
Yes, we do a great deal of professional learning with the teachers. And so, as I said, it's a full day curriculum. So it's not just SEL, it's the other 5 areas as well. So before they can even teach on day 1, they have to do 30 hours of professional learning. And we specifically engage and talk about identity and their own emotionality, the intersection of that with their teaching practice, intersection of that with the classroom culture, helping them with teaching them how not to label certain behaviors as negative or problematic. It's a challenge because we don't in this curriculum do sticker charts or token economies. We really focus on helping teachers to understand how do you create a positive learning environment where children are engaged? How do you support that engagement? How do you think about the connection to family? So they get that pre-service professional learning, and then they get continued 16 hours of professional development throughout the school year. So we do take that very seriously. I'm glad somebody asked that question because it is a very key component of this curriculum, because we feel that without it, teachers would cause harm trying to implement it. So you cannot even implement the curriculum unless you do the professional learning.
Interesting, thank you. We have a question someone who's interested in how a school can hold other teachers and administrators accountable when they're not being equitable towards marginalized children, especially when it's a large percentage of teachers or administrators treating Black children differently. And relatedly, when school structures themselves are discriminatory towards a particular style of expression or structured to encourage compliance with white norms.
So how to hold them accountable? Oh, that's a good question. That's a hard one. I don't know if I have the magic answer to that. If I did, I think I'd be in a different space. But I think what I have seen that works is questioning. I think it's you question. When you see something that doesn't look right, when you see children that are being historically underrepresented children being marginalized, or just children in general being marginalized, you should question those in power, authority, whether they're over your unit or the director of your school, and have them explain to you why what is happening, because oftentimes it provides a mirror to what's happening. And they see, wait, well, well, why are they treated? I don't understand. This same behavior was happening last week with this group of children. This was the response. What's the difference this week? Can you explain to me? Can you help me understand? I think another piece I think we need to do more of, and it's probably I know it's the researcher in me, is we sometimes need to give our leaders and our other colleagues information. It doesn't have to be a child development article or ECRQ article, but we also know that there's quote unquote lay articles, pieces that are easy to digest that we should just share, because sometimes it's also a lack of knowledge. I think the other piece is having asking your, whether it's the director of an early childhood program or the principal, ask them about, can we bring in professional development, professional learning around this topic, and be quote unquote a pain in the side, and keep asking and keep asking and keep asking, so that those needs are met. But I don't think I have a solution, but those are the things that I would recommend.
Yeah, thank you. There's another big question here for you to give us magical solutions to, but two different questions that I think are related. So given the current climate around race in schools, how would you suggest we help administrators and school boards continue to value centering race for the sake of children? And I think related, can you discuss how to center race in SEL with predominantly white administrators? So how can we balance what we're doing in schools versus what kids might be getting at home?
Yeah. And I'm not sure for part of this, because it was like, where we are in our society right now around race, I think also has to do with the ways in which cultural wars are happening. So I'm going to kind of speak to that a little bit. I just want to say, oftentimes when social emotional learning now has been kind of caught up in this, and like you even have states that say you can't talk about social emotional learning, that there's something wrong with it, that you're talking about race, that you are making people feel bad. And I kind of start with, what is it that we want? Don't we want children to enjoy school? We want them to be kind, considerate, passionate, make good decisions. Those are things we want. Then that's SEL. And so sometimes it's getting away from the actual, for some people, from some of these spaces where you feel like, I don't know if they're going to be able to hear me. Sometimes it's not using the label, but using the description. Even thinking about race, we want to support all children's identities. We want every child that walks into this building to be supported, to feel supported. What are the things we can do in a real way that can help them do that? The other piece, and this is a harder piece to have, I think it's harder if you're not the administrator, because if you were an administrator, I would say like there's a lot of self-reflective work that needs to happen as an administrator, but I just don't think the majority of our principal preparation or school director programs, early childhood even, don't have in them. And so that's kind of the work that we're trying to do, is to push that in. It's to start thinking about that. But I think that it's not about making somebody feel bad by looking at, because that's often the reaction you get if we talk about race, and these kids, white kids are going to feel bad. That's not the point, because the flip to that you should say is, but by not talking about it, we're making all these other kids feel bad. So we want everybody to feel good. So it's not like we're only going to say we're only valuing one particular race. We want everybody's race, ethnicity, and cultural values to be respected and supported in this space. Oftentimes, some of these things can be aligned to schools' missions. So I also recommend pulling that up and making the connection. This aligns to our mission. Are we saying we're now changing our mission? Again, ask questions. Make people speak back to you and explain what they're doing or what they're not doing. So at least it is out there in the open, and then you can make a plan for how to create action to deal with that. I also know some of this work is very hard to do in certain spaces right now. So I'm not even trying to undermine that. Like for instance, our curriculum, we don't even bother trying to implement in certain schools, because we know immediately the state school board already said they can't do it, right? And so this is the space of this work, and it's become quite a challenge, and I never would have thought that that's what we would be.
Yes, but here we are.
Here we are.
We have one final question I want to get addressed really quickly before we move on to our next speaker. Do you think that race or racial learning will ever be a requirement at the graduate level in teacher education? And maybe a supplement to that is, and how can we get there?
The funny thing is, a lot of programs would say, we do that. They have a diversity class. It's not a class. That's not the problem. It's the integration. Do I think we'll ever get there? I think there's some programs that are making their way there now. I think one of our program in particular is.
Mhm.
But I think it's the constant re-examining of it. Some of the work, depending on the state that you're in, the state allows you to do that, right? The state is pushing back on that. Like, how do we align to this? I think the real problem is that we don't integrate it throughout the entire teacher prep program. It's siloed into a class. And that's what SEL typically is. It's siloed into one curriculum that's done twice a week for 20 minutes. That's why we say it has to be incorporated throughout. And that's why it's incorporated throughout. I just, the one program I showed you, but I think the same is true in teacher education. They shouldn't have to wait till they get to my child development class to learn about these issues. And they learn about it their sophomore year, never to be talked about again. And so I think it's the same thing. We have to push it. And I think for those of you who are in higher education, who are educators, I think you need to question and problematize your syllabus. What are you doing? Are you incorporating it into it? Or are you just like, no, I just teach this one topic? Every topic, every topic, even statistics, because statisticians always say, but not mine, yours too. Race can be incorporated throughout.
Thank you. Well, this has been really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us today, Dr. Humphries.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I will now hand over the proverbial mic to Mikyung Baek from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity to introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dor and Dr. Humphries. Can you hear me? Yeah, so it was very interesting topic. And I think, thinking about how when the kids go into early childhood education, that's the first time in their life, discovering their racial and ethnic identity. So this is a very important topic to talk about. So thank you. So my name is Mikyung Baek. I work for Clemens Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity here at Ohio State, and I am a senior research associate here. Today, I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Clemens Noelke. He is the research director of the Diversity Data Kids Project at the Institute for Child, Youth, and Family Policy at Brandeis University. Dr. Noelke led the development of the Child Opportunity Index 2.0, which is the leading index of neighborhood opportunity for children in the US. And he'll talk about the COI 2.0 today. And he's trained as a quantitative sociologist with a focus on labor markets and population health. He received the Early Career Research Investigator Award from the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis University, and he has been widely published in major academic journals. His research has been quoted in major news outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, the Washington Post, The Economist, and The Political. He was a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard and holds both doctorate and master's degrees in sociology from the University of Mannheim, Germany. Today, Clemens will highlight how unequal neighborhood environments are an important factor contributing to racial ethnic inequities in children's healthy development. He will discuss the Child Opportunity Index and how it compares to single measure indicators such as neighborhood poverty levels, as well as look at the future of child opportunity maps and applications. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Clemens.
Thank you, Mikyung. Thank you for this very kind introduction. Let me just set up my PowerPoint here. Okay. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to present. I've spent the last 5 years working on a research agenda that was conceived and, if you will, fully mapped out at the Kirwan Institute. And in preparing for this talk, it was again humbling to see just how evolved and impactful opportunity mapping projects at Kirwan have been. And I know firsthand how hard it is to improve upon the excellent work you and your colleagues at Kirwan have done in this space. So first, briefly acknowledge my team and our funders. We're based at Brandeis University. The project's led by Professor Dolores Acevedo Garcia. We're currently receiving funding from the Robert Wood Johnson and W.K. Kellogg Foundations. I'd like to start with a simple motivating question that's on the minds of many practitioners, scientists, policymakers, and program administrators. How do you allocate resources equitably? And in particular, how do you allocate resources equitably across neighborhoods? There are massive inequities in access to neighborhood opportunity for children, And because of racial residential segregation, children's access to neighborhood opportunity is also very unequal across racial ethnic groups. So allocating resources equitably across neighborhoods can serve the dual purpose of reducing both neighborhood and racial ethnic inequities and access to opportunity. And opportunity indices provide you with a simple to work with and yet comprehensive measure of neighborhood opportunity. This opportunity map for the Detroit metro area shows the Child Opportunity Index, which is in brief the sum of neighborhood features that help children thrive. We and others build these indices and maps because they can help to advocate for greater equity and guide more equitable design and implementation of programs, policies, and organizational practices. Thompson versus the US Department of Housing and Urban Development was, to my knowledge, the first major consequential application of opportunity mapping. African-American residents of Baltimore public housing filed a lawsuit that was triggered by the proposed demolition of high-rise public housing located in segregated low-opportunity neighborhoods and the proposed rebuilding of low-rise public housing in similarly segregated low-opportunity neighborhoods. The final ruling in the case faulted HUD for failing to take a regional approach to public housing, essentially using the city, in the words of the judge overseeing the case, as an island reservation to house poor people in the Baltimore region. Among other things, the remedy included the funding of housing vouchers and facilitating the relocation of city public housing residents to communities of opportunity in the suburbs surrounding the city. John Powell, the executive director of Kirwan at the time, gave crucial expert testimony in this case, and the map shown here and the definition of communities of opportunity and, of course, the initial development of opportunity mapping were all done at the Kirwan Institute. Child Opportunity Index 1.0, launched in 2014, was an important next step in opportunity mapping, and it was based on a robust collaboration between diversitydatakits.org here at Brandeis and the Kirwan Institute. Opportunity mapping at Kirwan has often involved intensive community engagement and was focused on specific metro areas, counties, or cities. COI 1.0 increased the scope geographically, yielding an index focused on children for the 100 largest US metro areas. Thereafter, we continuously refined the COI, which yielded COI 2.0 that we launched in 2020, and afterwards worked closely with users supporting applications, learning about needs and funneling what we learned back into our data work. And we also positioned the index within a growing ecosystem of neighborhood metrics. I'll talk much more about COI 2.0 later, but I also want to note that we've worked hard on COI 3.0 that will be launched later this year. So in today's talk, I want to report on how we got here. And I've structured this report along 5 fundamental questions that were first asked and answered at Kirwan. What is opportunity mapping? Why do we need it? What does it tell us? How does it compare to other approaches? How is it used? And what does its future hold? If you're familiar with Kirwan's work, what I'll be telling you will hardly surprise you in several respects, but at the same time, the small and sometimes large innovations we introduced helped take opportunity mapping to a larger scale and achieve much more widespread recognition and adoption. So why do we need opportunity maps? To understand why, let's take a look at just 2 Detroit neighborhoods. This is a neighborhood map of the Detroit metro area. You're seeing 5 levels of neighborhood opportunity, from very low opportunity in light blue to very high opportunity in the darkest blue. You can see the city of Detroit in the center, marked by the yellow boundary, but you can also easily identify it as a cluster of very low opportunity neighborhoods at the center of the metro area, surrounded by high and very high opportunity suburbs. From these neighborhoods, we've selected 2 that we'll call A and B. And as a side note, we're using census tracts here to demarcate neighborhoods. Census tracts correspond to the Census Bureau's definition of neighborhoods. They have a population of about 4,000 people, and their boundaries often follow recognizable physical features like major roadways or rivers. A and B are located right next to each other, one just inside, one just outside the city boundary, about a mile apart. While they're very close together in space, they provide extremely different environments for children. Growing up in neighborhood A, economic precarity is the norm. 50% of household income have incomes below the federal poverty limit. In neighborhood B, economic security is the norm. The poverty rate is only 5%. But it's not just about poverty. Only 1/3 of children in neighborhood A attend preschool, while half of all children in neighborhood B do. Compared to A, B provides better access to green space and healthy food and has much less vacant housing. And those are just some of the features that contribute to the opportunity gap between those two neighborhoods. A large body of research has shown that these features matter for children's healthy development. They affect the quality of their everyday lives, but also their long-term outcomes, including educational attainment, labor market income, and health. So the Child Opportunity Index is a metric that captures the wide range of neighborhood factors that matter for children today. It's based on 29 indicators spanning 3 domains. Included are many social determinants of health. It's neighborhood level data for nearly all US neighborhoods that's comparable across neighborhoods and over time. And it has good predictive validity compared to similar metrics. So why do we need opportunity indices? Why can't we just work with the poverty rate or a simple metric of neighborhood resources? First, we generally find that as a composite index, the COI is more predictive of different outcomes than any of its components or other commonly used metrics. Second, if you're looking for a measure that captures neighborhood quality in a broad sense as it concerns children in a single number, the COI does just that. There's better content validity than any single metric of neighborhood opportunity. Third, it can be more efficient to track a single well-constructed index number than 29 indicators for many applied uses and also research uses. Fourth, compared to a single metric, the COI as a composite index better captures racial ethnic inequity and access to neighborhood opportunity. We call this equity validity. A metric with good equity validity powerfully captures the racialized geography of opportunity or the extremely unequal neighborhood environments that children of different races grow up in. For example, compared to white children, Black children often live in neighborhoods that not only have higher poverty rates, but also more pollution and schools with fewer resources. A valid measure of neighborhood opportunity, we think, needs to capture these cumulative compounding disadvantages that underlie the racialized geography of opportunity in the US. So what opportunity or similar indices are out there and how are they constructed? The 2 closest analogs to the COI are the Area Deprivation Index published by the University of Wisconsin and the Social Vulnerability Index published by the CDC. The ADI is a measure of socioeconomic status or deprivation. It's conceived as a single underlying construct that is a function of all these different neighborhood features like the poverty rate, educational attainment, and measures of wealth, affluence, or poverty. Most indicators reflect the population composition, but it also has structural features like the quality of housing or income inequality. The SVI was conceived for disaster preparedness or aid disaster preparedness efforts. It contains indicators of risk or vulnerability in the event of a catastrophe. Like the ADI, most indicators describe the composition of the population. There's also housing variables, for example, the percentage of people in group quarters, dorms, or prisons, or multi-unit structures, which is relevant for evacuation planning. The COI tries to measure structural features of neighborhoods that exist independently of the population living there, at least in the short term, and whenever the data permits. And it uses data from many different sources, while the other metrics shown here rely only on the American Community Survey. One important issue is whether or not racial ethnic neighborhood composition should be included in a neighborhood opportunity index. Sometimes inclusion of racial, ethnic, or similar metrics is warranted. For example, you might include the percentage of non-English speakers in an index that is built to guide evacuation protocols in the event of a natural disaster. But research has also shown that racial ethnic neighborhood composition predicts children's outcomes even with individual race and ethnicity controlled. Well, we think that from a moral or policy standpoint, it's problematic to associate the presence or absence of specific racial ethnic groups with neighborhood opportunity. So our approach is to separately measure structural features of neighborhoods, the neighborhood opportunity structure, if you will, independent from the people living there. We omit racial ethnic composition and develop an index that's strongly correlated with racial ethnic composition and highlight whenever we can the association between the index and neighborhood racial ethnic composition, which is now non-trivial because we didn't already include composition into the metric. So there's a range of approaches to combine the metrics. For COI 1.0 and many other indices, you just average the indicators where every indicator counts equally. But you might feel that not every indicator is of equal importance to children, and some should count more than others. So for COI 2.0, we use weights that reflect how strongly the indicators are correlated with outcomes. But you might also do this with a community input, or you might use machine learning or something like this. SVI and ADI use principal component analysis, so they are the principal component of the indicators they are constructed from. And PCA is often used to, in a situation where you have many partial or imperfect measures of a single underlying construct. And then you use PCA to derive a single score that hopefully better captures what you're trying to measure than any of its components. The COI, in our opinion, is more like a stock price index or the inflation rate. We don't really think that neighborhood opportunity exists as a single unitary thing out there, but it really is the sum of many different, sometimes independent, sometimes correlated neighborhood features. And an opportunity index is just a handy statistical summary of a more complex phenomenon. So specifically, what are the indicators that we included? There's 29 indicators grouped into 3 domains. The education domain has 11 indicators, 3 capturing access to and quality of early childhood education, 2 indicators of academic proficiency in 3rd grade, 3 capturing the quality of elementary schools, and 3 indicators capturing resources important for educational achievement. In the health and environment domain, we have indicators for access to healthy environments, such as green space or walkable neighborhoods, exposure to environmental toxins, and access to healthcare. The social and economic domain includes an index of neighborhood economic resources and indicators of economic opportunity and family structure. To measure them on the same scale, we standardized the indicators and then took weighted averages within the 3 domains, where weights capture how strongly each indicator predicts 4 different health and socioeconomic outcomes. To obtain a single overall score, we then took a weighted average of the 3 domain scores and lastly converted the z-scores into 2 easily interpretable metrics, child opportunity scores and child opportunity levels. Child opportunity scores vary from 1 to 100. To construct them, we ranked all neighborhoods on domain and overall scores, grouped them into 100 groups containing 1% of the child population each, and gave each group of neighborhoods a score from 1 the lowest to 100 the highest. Child opportunity levels are built much the same way, the difference being that we group neighborhoods to 5 groups, labeled from very low to very high, containing 20% of the child population each. There's different versions of the metrics. If your goal is to compare neighborhoods within the same metro, you can use the metro normed metrics. And for state comparisons, you would use the state normed metrics. And for all other cases, you'd use nationally normed metrics. All right. So much for the theory and methodology. What does the COI show? What kind of patterns can you discover or illustrate? So this, again, is an opportunity map of the Detroit metro area. You see the city in the center surrounded by high opportunity suburbs. This is where Black children live in relation to opportunity in low and very low opportunity urban neighborhoods. And this is where white children live in relation to opportunity, predominantly in high and very high opportunity suburban neighborhoods. 60% of Black children in Detroit, in the metro area, live in very low opportunity neighborhoods, but only 3% of white children do. At the other end, 27% of white children live in very high opportunity neighborhoods, but only 3% of Black children do. We find very similar patterns of inequality nationwide. Nearly 50% of Black, 40% of American Native, and 30% of Hispanic children live in very low opportunity neighborhoods, but only 10% of Asian and 8% of white children do. And at the other end of the distribution, the the pattern is reversed. Only about 7% of Black, American Native, and Hispanic children live in very high opportunity neighborhoods, but 37% of Asian and 28% of white children do. If you look within specific metros, you see the same extremely large gaps in opportunity, and they tend to reflect urban-suburban opportunity gaps like the ones we just saw for Detroit, combined with racial ethnic residential segregation. Here's another look at the same pattern. Each dot in this scatter plot is a metro area. For each metro, we calculated the child opportunity score in neighborhoods where the median white and neighborhoods where the median Black child lives, and then subtract the Black from the white median. So you get a large gap, positive numbers for almost all metros, some as big as 80 points on a scale from 1 to 100. And that's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, we have a measure of Black-white residential segregation, the dissimilarity index. So what we see here is essentially that metro areas differ a lot in terms of how large the gap in neighborhood opportunity is for Black and white children, and that metro areas with large gaps are also particularly segregated. This illustrates well how historical structural racism has created unequal neighborhood environments for children of different races. And in order to examine the link between structural racism and present-day inequity more directly, we have worked with researchers at the Cohen Institute to map government redlining maps drawn by the Homeowner Loan Corporation in the 1930s to present-day neighborhood data. So this was work done with Mi-Kyung Baek, Michael Outridge, and Jason Rees at Kirwan. The Homeowner Loan Corporation was created in the aftermath of the Great Depression to help struggling homeowners. Hope drew the now infamous redlining neighborhood maps, rating neighborhoods on a scale from best to worst, where the worst or derated areas were drawn in red. The ratings are accompanied by area descriptions that reveal strong racist sentiments as important factors determining the ratings. The sociologist Jacob Faber argues that Hoke essentially legitimized and took to scale racist appraisal practices that were prevalent in the real estate sector long before the maps were drawn and shaped neighborhood trajectories over the following 80 years. So here we show that these historical ratings are still robustly associated with present-day neighborhood opportunity, even after controlling for 1940s census tract measures. A-rated neighborhoods still have a nearly 20-point advantage in the adjusted models on a scale from 1 to 100. We also see a robust effect on percentage of white children, reflecting the impact of Hoke maps on segregation. Now, the differences in neighborhood opportunity matter. Here's life expectancy at birth, averaged across all neighborhoods with the same opportunity level. You can see a very clear gradient where more neighborhood opportunities are strongly associated with living longer lives. The gap between very high and very low opportunity neighborhoods is 7 years. Here's life expectancy at birth, averaged across all neighborhoods with the same opportunity score from 1 to 100. You see the same gradient, but now you also see this nonlinear drop-off in life expectancy for neighborhoods with very low opportunity scores. Here we examined mortality risk directly in individual level data, and these results agree with the results on life expectancy. Using representative data on 1 million US children, we find that children in very low opportunity neighborhoods have a 40% increased risk of death compared to children growing up in very high opportunity neighborhoods. Children in very low opportunity neighborhoods also have a 60% increased risk of death, of experiencing the death of a caregiver compared to children growing up in very high opportunity neighborhoods. One contributing factor is differential exposure to violence. This study uses 2020 data from 40 children's hospitals located throughout the country. Among the children who suffered a gunshot wound, nearly 50% came from very low opportunity neighborhoods, but only 5% came from very high opportunity neighborhoods. The COI is a powerful predictor of child and adult health outcomes that are now motivating a growing number of applications in the healthcare and other sectors. But how does it compare to other metrics? Our tests show that the COI explains more variation in census tract outcomes than other commonly used metrics of neighborhood conditions. Each dot in this chart is the R-squared value from a bivariate regression of the census tract level outcome, for example, life expectancy, on a neighborhood metric. The census tract opportunity metrics are the COI 2.0, from the opportunity atlas metric of intergenerational mobility, poverty rate, and the social vulnerability and area deprivation indices. In the top row, we're showing the shared variation between the COI and the other four metrics. Shared variation is around 50 to 80%, meaning that the four metrics capture some or a lot of the same things about neighborhoods. But as the following rows show, the COI is most strongly associated with these health and socioeconomic outcomes than the other metrics. This is the summary result for life expectancy. The ADI is slightly more strongly associated with it than the COI, and that's perhaps because it was initially developed to predict mortality. However, across these different outcomes, the COI performs consistently better. It explains on average 44% of the variation across these 10 outcomes, while the poverty rate explains 39%, SVI 37%, ADI 33%, and opportunity atlas 32%. Lastly, we're exploring the association between the metrics and neighborhood racial ethnic composition. The SVI is most strongly associated with census tract percentage non-white children, but the percentage of non-white residents is also a component of the index, so it's a bit of an unfair comparison. The COI is next, and then followed by the poverty rate. So overall, among these metrics, the COI is the only one that focuses on multidimensional neighborhood features for children growing up in the US today. Compared to rival metrics, it's most strongly associated with racial ethnic neighborhood composition, as well as health and socioeconomic outcomes. Very briefly, so what's next for opportunity mapping? And then I'd like to end with just a few examples of applications. But I'll only talk about COI 3.0 briefly at this point. While COI 2.0 is available for 2010, 2015 data, COI 3.0 will have annual data from 2010 through 2021. And we're developing our data pipelines to support at least biannual updates going forward. We published COI 2.0 for census tracts and later zip codes, but COI 3.0 will be produced at the census block level for 2010 and 2020 census blocks. And that gives us the opportunity to aggregate it to really any geography that might be helpful for all sorts of applications, including, of course, census tracts and zip codes. We're adding at least 6 additional measures, including measures of social and organizational capital and housing quality, and refined measures of several important metrics, such as school quality and access to green space. And we're also refining our algorithm to construct the composite index from component indicators in order to improve the predictive validity. So just very briefly, how has the COI been used to increase equity? Researchers have used the COI together with other data to measure community assets and needs. They've used the COI to show spatial and racial ethnic inequities and access to opportunity, and quantifies association, for example, with health outcomes to aid decision-making for place-based investments or other type of healthcare interventions. Observed inequities highlighted by the COI can be used to raise awareness in the media and to inform advocacy for more equitable resource allocation. For example, we found that the index and our initial results highlighting racial ethnic inequities resonated well with journalists and readers when we launched the COI in 2020. The coverage amplified the equity focus, and in the aftermath, we got a lot of mail from readers who were concerned about how the neighborhoods they live in fare in terms of child opportunity. And that shows that you can still tell stories with the COI that resonate with many different audiences, that raise awareness around unequal access to opportunity, and that motivate policies for more equitable investment into child opportunity. The number of health-related academic papers focused on the COI has increased substantially after the launch in 2020. We've seen similar surges in demand by looking at web traffic to our site, data downloads, and also emails and inquiries that we receive. So just 2 applications. The COI is being used to identify high opportunity areas for a housing mobility program run by the Massachusetts Department for Housing and Community Development. The program is called Supporting Neighborhood Opportunity in Massachusetts. It's for current Section 8 voucher holders with a child under the age of 18 in the household. Program participants receive support to move to high opportunity areas, including financial and mobility assistance. The goal is to move families with children out of low into high opportunity neighborhoods, and to define those, the COI is an appropriate metric because it captures a wide range of features that make neighborhoods good places for children to grow up in. I want to close with this example because it illustrates a very easy way to think about targeting resources equitably using neighborhood data. It's about where to plant trees, but you can replace trees in this example with many other place-based investments. So the city of Akron in Ohio assessed this city's tree canopy and explored different scenarios for growing it. They have funds to plant, I forget the exact number, 5,000 or 10,000 trees, but where do you plant it? The first areas you might consider are those that currently have low tree canopy. The second thing you might consider might be equity. Is there a way to planting trees or investing that could reduce inequities in access to healthy environments? So this map identifies both neighborhoods that have low tree canopy coverage and are low opportunity. Why not invest in those places first? Thank you. Thank you for listening. And I think we're now moving to the Q&A.
Well, thank you, Clemens. I'm excited to see this 3.0. You did a lot more than 2.0, and you also shortened the time that we had to spend from 1.0 to 2.0. It was 6 years. Now it's only 3 years. You are getting, launching the 3.0. So that's great job. Okay, so I'm looking at the Q&A here. A couple of questions regarding how the opportunity scores correspond to gentrification. Any thoughts on how it improves the outcome for children in the areas that are gentrified? What is the difference, outcome in terms of difference in outcome in terms of the previous residents versus new residents where after the neighborhood has been gentrified?
Thank you for this. That's a very interesting question. Thank you. I think there's at least two questions here, right? One is sort of how does gentrification affect the index, and how sort of does variation in neighborhood opportunity caused by gentrification impact current residents and maybe former residents who were displaced? Regarding the first question, right, increase gentrification would of course increase the opportunity index as long as it goes along, with increased economic resources in the community and sort of changes in the composition of the population towards more highly educated people. However, the other question is who has then access to the opportunities that are perhaps generated slowly, over time in these neighborhoods that may not have been there before. And that's of course difficult because there's also then a question, who gets to live there and can still afford to live there? What you'd really have to examine is the neighborhoods that families who are displaced have access to and whether they manage to improve. So on the other hand, the children then growing up in those neighborhoods would, theoretically at least, in the long term benefit, from the development that has taken place, insofar as, it really translates into more comprehensive improvement of opportunity for children in particular.
Yeah, that's true. It's all about who has access to those areas, who can live in that area, however opportunity level there is, right?
Yes.
So the next question that I have is about the deprivation index. It lists family structure, noting single parent. And so the question is, do you think that this is vastly oversimplified and based on a white middle class model of the ideal family rather than strong intergeneration ties, for instance?
Yes, I do think it's widely oversimplified. And I agree with the question, and with problematizing this. But let me say this in defense. Like, if you look at empirical studies, there's a very, very robust negative effect of single parenthood on children's outcomes. And there's also a very robust neighborhood level effect of the percentage of single parent families on children's outcomes. It was one of the strongest results that came out of the Opportunity Atlas study by Raj Chetty at Harvard. So we need to kind of grapple with that. What I think it means is that what we're tapping into is like differences in resources across communities that relate to networks, perhaps among parents, that relate to the amount of time that is available, just the time budgets of parents that can be used, to focus on children and to build, community resources that help children, like attend PTA meetings, contribute to like sports clubs, after-school programs that require volunteers, all those things. And if you impact of welfare reform has certainly been to require single mothers or single fathers to work. So in this context, I think what we're measuring, is a kind of a scarcity of social resources, and I think that's what these metrics might be measuring, aside from poverty. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah, there's always, multiple level of things that you have to, look into, right? So that you can say on a map that you have like a certain level of opportunity, but
no, But let me say, we're certainly not endorsing, or neither I think are the creators of the ADI endorsing like a specific model of family as the only right one.
Right, that's true.
It's about resources, I think.
Mm-hmm. And also there was a question about how do you weigh the indicators? What was the highest weighted indicator that you had in the COI 2.0, I guess that question is.
I have a slide. I'm not going to show the slide. I just need to remind myself. So we weigh the indicators in each domain, and the weights within each domain sum up to 1. And let's say in the health and environment domain, the health insurance coverage, housing vacancy rates are among the most influential. In the education domain, school poverty, reading scores, and parental education attainment are among the most influential. And in the social economic domain, the economic resources are among the most influential. But then in the final index, all the 3 domains count about equally.
Okay, thank you. One general question: what was some of the most surprising findings did your research reveal, and what are your recommendations to change them?
Well, I don't think this is really much of this is really surprising. We are just finding a way of showing inequities that we all really know well and have known for a long time about, and trying to raise awareness and sort of bringing it into new fields where there has not been as much attention being paid to those issues. I think maybe people here or here in this audience for this look intimately familiar, but it's certainly not true everywhere. I mean, we've just heard in Dr. Humphries' talk the importance of putting greater emphasis on race in socio-emotional learning. Similarly, we're saying, while we know this, neighborhoods matter, this is not far from widely recognized in the medical sector, for example. You've seen the growth in papers. It's really, because for the first time, some scholars are turning their eye towards this and are trying to think about what this means for their everyday practice. And similarly, in policy or program administration, much more can be done than is commonly being done in order to more equitably direct funding or program resources. And you just need a tool for it and to push it, and some sort of a tool that everyone agrees this has good properties. We like this, we want to keep on using this.
Yeah, as we always say at Kerwin, the opportunity mapping, the mapping is just the starting point of the to talk about what's going on on the neighborhood, and then you can start from there to talk about how this has happened, like the redlining map that we did, to relate to opportunity, and also how we move from here in terms of changing the policy or changing the labor structure. So yeah, thank you. And there is a couple of questions about COI 3.0 asking if the census block group level measure is more predicative than census tract level.
I don't know. I don't really know yet. Yeah. I think, or at least not for all indicators. My suspicion is that it's not, because census tracts have, among the available definitions that we have, a lot of data on, have performed really well. The reason we're doing it at the block level is just it's to achieve time series consistency, right? There has been a break every 10 years in census tract definitions, and in order to do a long time series, that's our goal. We need to map, translate 2010 to 2020 data, and the other way around. And the best way of doing this is at the block level, because there's the least amount of crosswalking required, but it also gives us, the opportunity then to aggregate to any other geography, custom, or Census Bureau defined that we might want to compute opportunity indices for. So it's a lot more work, though.
A lot more work, yeah. I mean, everybody listening to the webinar, I mean, all the data is available at census tract level if we go to Diversity Data Kits website. So that's very useful for everybody to use it. That's why it's being used a lot of researchers across the country. So check out their website. So the last question that I have is, what community alliance can be beneficial with your research findings to promote sustainable equity?
What types of community alliance?
Alliance, yes.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer so generally, but I think it depends on the community, first of all, and the specific issues that need to be addressed. It might be, combating pollution. It might be about, improving access to early childcare, or improving the quality of education, or after-school programs. It very much depends on what the needs of specific communities are. And the COI can always be used as one data point in these conversations to illustrate, where resources are particularly have been historically scarce, and what the exact shape of equity issues is in a community. And in that sense, it can be helpful. But I think it's hard to say that it is also a very general level.
Yeah, it's very dependent upon what your focus is and what your area of focus to work on the policy or making changes, I guess. Thank you, Clemens. So this has been a very wonderful presentation. Thank you. Good to see you. And thank you both for sharing your work with us, Dr. Humphries and Clemens. And thank you all attending the webinar, for joining us today. When you leave the meeting, when you click on that leave meeting, you will have a very short survey pop up. So please fill out that if you're able, because we will use your feedback, reflect your feedback in planning our future forums. So thank you again for joining us, and we are on time, 1:30. So have a great day, everybody. Thank you, Clemens.
Thank you.